I stood before the mirror, staring at the stranger looking back at me. The flab around my waist, the lines at the corners of my eyes, and those eyes themselves, empty, hollow, devoid of all the light they once held. "Elena," I said to the woman in the glass, "you're 38, not 83. Who was that woman in the mirror? She wore a faded old nightgown, her hair twisted into a careless knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was bare, no makeup, no color, nothing but the charcoal smudges of exhaustion carved deep beneath her eyes. The soft roll of flesh around her midsection was impossible to hide beneath the thin cotton, her shoulders rounded and thick as a wall. Her collarbones had vanished entirely, buried under a layer of padding that hadn't been there 3 years ago. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a photo from a decade past. There she was, at 28, 102 pounds, crisp in a white power suit, short hair tucked neatly behind her ears, standing in her newly renovated office with a grin that said she owned the world. Her eyes in that photo were incandescent. She held the phone up beside the mirror and compared. The woman on the left, the woman on the right. Were they the same person? Where had the light in those eyes gone? Where was the body that could run 5 kilometers without breathing hard? Where was the woman who had once stood on a stage and held a room of 300 people in the palm of her hand? Where had all of it gone? She looked down at her hands, puffy knuckles, nails clipped short and practical, a pale ring of missing tan circling her fourth finger. Daniel's ring was gone now, but the ghost of it remained, like a dry riverbed that remembered the water that used to flow through. "Elena," she said to the woman in the mirror, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking to someone on the brink of death. "You are 38 years old, not 83. The woman in the glass looked back at her, eyes still vacant. But in that exact moment, something flickered in the deepest recess of her gaze, so faint it was almost imperceptible, like a hibernating creature stirring in the dark of its den. Most people wouldn't have noticed it at all, but it was there. She stared at that faint glimmer for a long, long time. Then she turned and dug through the bottom of her closet, pulling out a pair of running shoes thick with dust. Chapter 1. The scratch of the pen against paper was unnervingly loud, like a tiny blade carving through something invisible. Elena stared at her own fingers and noticed they were trembling. Not from sadness, she told herself. It was just that the air conditioning in this conference room was set far too low. "Mrs. Lynn, if you could just look here." The lawyer pushed his glasses up his nose and slid a stack of documents a few inches closer to her. "Regarding custody." "He gets it." She cut him off, her voice more level than she'd expected. "Standard visitation rights will be fine." The man across the table lifted his eyes. Daniel Joe wore his usual charcoal suit, tie meticulously knotted, hair immaculately combed, every angle of his expression calibrated to perfection. 1 part remorse, 1 part helplessness, and the remaining 4 parts, the condescending tolerance she'd grown so weary of. "Elena," he began, his tone as gentle as a neighbor discussing weekend plans. "About the children, perhaps we could—" "Daniel." She met his gaze, and for the first time she realized just how wide this table was between them. Wide enough to hold 10 years of marriage, all of it now reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. "Sign the papers." The lawyer murmured something about cooperation and amicable resolution. Elena's eyes drifted past Daniel's shoulder to the window behind him. This building sat in the city's most expensive district, and from the 43rd floor you could see half the skyline. She used to sit behind a window just like this one, sharp in a tailored suit and 8-inch heels, commanding conference rooms with the sheer force of her presence. Back then, Daniel was just starting his company, and she was his lead investor, his most valuable partner, his fiercest advocate. Then he'd asked her to come home. "The company's stable now. You're always on the road. Who's going to raise the children?" That was how he'd put it, voice warm with the certainty of a man who believed he was doing her a favor. "Besides, I can take care of you." She'd believed him. "Elena?" The lawyer's voice cut back in. "Regarding asset division, Mr. Joe has proposed." "Prenuptial agreement," she said. Something flickered across Daniel's face. He was the one who'd insisted on that agreement, arguing that it was fair for both of them. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. She had far more assets than he did back then, so the agreement protected her more than him. In hindsight, perhaps he'd been calculating from the very beginning. "Elena, you don't have to do this." His voice dropped lower, carrying the hint of irritation only she could detect. "I'll give you the house, the car, alimony. Me? I said we'll follow the prenup." She pushed her chair back and rose to her feet. "Whatever it says, we'll do." Behind her, she heard the scrape of chair legs against marble, then Daniel's footsteps closing the gap. "Elena!" His fingers closed around her wrist. "We've been together for 10 years. She looked down at his hand. Clean, well-manicured nails. A simple platinum wedding band still circling his finger. She remembered picking out that ring. Plain, elegant, engraved with their initials on the inside. She'd thought it meant forever. "Daniel," she said, slowly pulling her arm free. "When you were in the Maldives with that intern from your marketing department last month, did you think about the word forever then?" His composure cracked for a fraction of a second before smoothing back over. "You've got it all wrong. That was a company retreat." "I don't care." She cut him off, and this time she meant it. "I don't care if it was a retreat or a honeymoon. It doesn't matter anymore. Sign the papers, and we're done." She turned and walked toward the door, her heels striking the marble floor in a crisp rhythm that felt strangely grounding. Behind her, Daniel's voice came again, a note higher than before. "Elena, wait, let's talk about this." She didn't look back. The elevator doors closed behind her, and only then did she allow herself to slump against the cold metal wall, eyes shut, chest tight, with something she refused to name. "Don't cry," she told herself. "At least not here." The elevator stopped at 36. The doors slid open, and 2 young women stepped in, impeccably dressed, in designer suits, venti Starbucks cups in hand, chattering about a limited edition lipstick launch. Their eyes swept over Elena in that particular way women have of cataloguing each other. The Max Mara coat that was at least 3 seasons old, the smudged makeup, the dark circles, the softness around her middle. Elena sucked in her stomach on instinct. The elevator continued its descent. She watched her own reflection in the polished stainless steel. A 38-year-old woman, recently divorced, unemployed, carrying too much weight, fine lines fanned out from eyes that had lost their spark. The Max Mara coat had fit beautifully 5 years ago. Now she couldn't even button it, leaving it open and using a scarf to obscure the extra inches. She remembered last week's parent-child activity at Siki's preschool. All the other mothers clustered together, chatting. She'd stood slightly apart, and she'd heard it clearly, one of them murmuring, "That's Mrs. Joe, isn't it? She's put on so much weight." And another, "I heard her husband's company is doing really well now. She just stays home with the kid. You know how it is once women stop working." They hadn't finished the sentence. They didn't need to. The elevator reached the lobby with a soft chime. The 2 young women stepped out first, their heels clicking with the confident rhythm of youth. Elena followed a few paces behind, feeling like she was wearing someone else's ill-fitting costume and stumbling through someone else's stage. Her phone buzzed. A message from the lawyer. "Mrs. Lin, the agreement has been signed by Mr. Zhou. I'll follow up on the rest." That was it. 10 years. A sheaf of paper. 3 signatures. She emerged from the building into a light autumn drizzle. October grey pressed low over the city, and the rain fell in needles fine enough to be almost invisible, yet cold enough to prickle the skin. She hadn't brought an umbrella. She stood under the portico for a long moment, weighing her options, and then walked straight into the rain. Plane trees lined the street, their leaves turning gold and dropping in wet clumps that clung to the pavement, soft and slippery underfoot. She walked without knowing where she was going, her phone buzzing again, this time the school. "Mrs. Zhou, will you be picking up Siqi today? All the other children have left." "I'm on my way," she said. She hailed a cab. Settling into the back seat, she caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror. Damp hair plastered to her temples, mascara smudged into faint grey tracks beneath her eyes. She pulled a tissue from her bag and dabbed, but it only smeared more. The cab wove through the city, past downtown high-rises, past gridlocked traffic, past crowds flowing in and out of subway stations. She leaned against the seat and let the blurred streetscape wash over her, thinking about the first time she'd come to this city 10 years ago. She had been 24 then, fresh off a master's in finance, flush with cash from selling a patent and carrying a reckless, unshakable certainty that she could conquer the world. 2 years on Wall Street had shown her the highs and lows of the game, and she'd been hungry, hungrier than anyone she knew. And she'd done it. Founded her investment firm at 26. Won Young Investor of the Year at 28. Crossed into 7 figures by 29. She wore Prada and carried Hermes, and she blazed through the male-dominated finance world with such velocity that nobody dared underestimate her for being young or female. At 30, she met Daniel. He'd just left his corporate job to start an internet health venture. The idea was solid, but he was short on capital. She'd read his business plan, liked what she saw, and made the first investment. Then the meetings turned into dinners, and the dinners turned into something more. He was smart, steady, and measured, a welcome contrast to the frantic energy of the men she usually dealt with. They dated, they married. He proposed the prenup, and she'd agreed without hesitation, since her assets dwarfed his. She genuinely believed that 2 financially independent people could build something purer together. A year later, she got pregnant. After Siqi was born, Daniel began the soft campaign. "The company's stable now," he'd told her, cradling their newborn daughter in his arms, his expression earnest. "You've been burning yourself out for so long. It's time to take a breath. The baby needs you, and honestly, I need you too. I want you here." She'd hesitated. Her firm was expanding, with several major deals in the pipeline. But she'd looked down at her daughter's tiny face, then back at her husband's hopeful eyes, and convinced herself that maybe he was right. She'd been running full tilt for years. Maybe it was time for a different pace. So she'd handed management over to her partner, stepped back from operations, and kept only her equity. Her new life became drop Siqi at school, lunch with the other stay-at-home wives, wait for Daniel to come home for dinner. At first, the novelty was pleasant. She'd never had time for a proper lunch before. But the novelty lasted 6 months at most. She grew restless. The other wives' conversations revolved around beauty, shopping, children, and husbands. She had nothing to contribute, and she didn't want to contribute. She wanted to talk about market trends, tech valuations, the next wave of innovation. But they'd look at her with pitying condescension. "Why are you still thinking about all that, sweetie?" "Elena, you're married now," one of them had once said, patting her hand. "A woman's job is taking care of her family. Your husband's so successful, you should just enjoy it." She'd smiled and said nothing. Eventually, she'd tried to re-engage with work, reaching out to old contacts, only to find that many of those bridges had decayed. Daniel's company grew larger, her own name faded from the industry's consciousness. Elena Lynn became Daniel Joe's wife. Then she'd gotten pregnant again, and then she'd lost it. 2 miscarriages in 3 years, and the aftermath left her hormones in disarray, her weight spiraling upward despite everything she tried. Dieting, running, acupuncture, all of it barely making a dent. Daniel told her he didn't mind, that she was beautiful just as she was, but the way he looked at her changed. He came home later, traveled more, spoke less. She started catching unfamiliar perfume on his shirt collars, noticing encrypted messaging apps on his phone. She'd asked once. He'd told her not to worry. She chose to believe him. Or perhaps she chose to pretend. Until last month, when she'd spotted him in a shopping mall with a young woman in a white dress, her waist impossibly narrow, her smile impossibly bright. She looked like fresh flowers in a vase, and Daniel's face as he laughed at something she'd said. Elena recognized that expression. It was the same one he'd worn when he was courting her years ago. She hadn't confronted them. She'd just stood there and watched for a while, then turned and walked away. That evening, Daniel came home as usual, eating dinner with practiced ease, asking about her day. She'd looked across the table at his face and felt only the strangeness of a stranger. "We need to talk," she'd said. He'd tried to deny it, explain it away. She'd simply pulled up the photos on her phone. He'd been silent for a very long time. Finally, "I'm sorry, Elena." "The agreement," she'd said. "We'll do it by the agreement." The cab pulled up outside the private kindergarten. Elena paid and stepped out into rain that had softened to a near mist. She walked quickly to the gate and found Siti waiting under the covered porch, backpack on her small shoulders, face wrinkled in unmistakable displeasure. "Mummy, you're so late!" The 5-year-old launched herself at Elena's legs. "Everyone else already left." "I'm sorry." Elena crouched and lifted her daughter. "Traffic." Siti looped her arms around Elena's neck, her small head settling in the crook of her shoulder. "Mummy, you're all wet. You feel cold." Mommy didn't bring an umbrella. "I'll bring mine next time," Siti announced with absolute seriousness. "I have the ducky umbrella. We can share." Something cracked in Elena's chest. She hugged her daughter tighter, pressing her face into the soft crown of her hair, breathing in the mingled scent of baby shampoo and daycare soap. On the ride home, TC chattered about her day. So-and-so had painted a huge flower. So-and-so had hidden her vegetables under the table. The teacher's voice had gone scratchy in the middle of story time. Elena murmured responses, her thoughts adrift elsewhere. At home, she washed Siki's hands and reheated leftovers from the fridge. She watched her daughter scoop rice with clumsy spoon strokes and looked around the apartment. Daniel's choice, a sprawling flat in the city's priciest district, all expensive taste and cold finishes. The furniture was beautiful. The art was tasteful. The crystal chandelier glittered, but sitting at that gleaming table, all she felt was the chill of empty space. "Mommy," TC said suddenly, "is Daddy coming home for dinner tonight?" Elena's throat tightened. "Daddy has things to do." "Oh." Chichi stabbed at her rice. After a pause, "Is Daddy not coming home for dinner anymore?" Elena didn't know how to answer. She looked at her daughter's eyes, round and almond-shaped just like her own, and saw the careful, guarded question inside them. 5 years old, and she already understood more than she should. "Cece," Elena said, setting down her chopsticks. "Mummy and Daddy are going to live in different places now. You'll live with me, and you can see Daddy on weekends, all right?" Cece blinked. Her lower lip quivered, but she didn't cry. Instead, she pushed back her chair, slid off it, and walked around to Elena's side. Her small arms wrapped around Elena's waist, her face pressing into the softness of her mother's stomach. "Then don't be sad, Mommy," she mumbled against the fabric. "I'm here." Elena's tears finally broke free. Later that night, after Cece was tucked in and asleep, Elena sat alone in the silent living room, the wall clocks ticking the only sound. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to Daniel Joe in her contacts, and let her finger hover over the delete button for a long moment. Then she pressed it. She stood and walked to the full-length mirror in the bedroom, unbuttoned her coat, let it fall. The woman in the glass, thick middle, slack skin, sagging breasts, rounded shoulders. She turned sideways and saw the soft double curve of her jaw, the lines beginning to form at her throat. She touched the corner of her eye, tracing the fine network of creases the overhead light picked out so cruelly. This was 38. The woman who had once commanded boardrooms. The woman who had run through city streets in heels to catch a client. The woman who'd been profiled as one of the most promising female investors of her generation. This was what she'd become, a bloated, exhausted shell full of self-doubt. She remembered the two young women in the elevator. Their glances hadn't been malicious, just a weary acknowledgement between women of what happens when a life becomes an annex. She remembered the preschool mother's whispers. They were right. She was heavy. She was faded. She looked like exactly what she was, a kept woman, someone's wife, an identity eclipsed. She remembered Daniel's final look at her, that blend of pity and impatience, his unspoken judgment. To him, she was no longer the woman who had once been his equal. She was an accessory, a fixture, a piece of furniture he'd once valued and now took for granted. The woman in the mirror stared back, her gaze a void. Elena reached out and turned the mirror to face the wall. She didn't want to see herself. But that night, she dreamed she was 28 again, crisp in white, standing on the pitch floor of a conference hall, explaining her investment model to a sea of faces. Her voice was clear. Her logic was sharp. When she reached the crescendo of her argument, someone started clapping, and then the whole room joined in, a thunder of appreciation that lifted her off her feet. She woke with her heart still racing and a wet patch on her pillow. 4:50 in the morning, sky still dark outside. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her pulse thrumming with that phantom feeling of flight. Where had she gone? That 28-year-old Elena. She sat up, turned on the lamp, and pulled out the old photo album from the bottom of her dresser drawer. The first page showed her at 28, standing in her newly renovated office with her proudly chosen logo wall behind her, all crisp white suit and dazzling confidence. 102 pounds. Now she was 134. She closed the album, picked up her phone, scrolled through contacts. She hadn't told anyone about the divorce, not her parents back home, who were too old to worry, not her friends, those old comrades who had drifted away over the years as she withdrew from the world. The occasional text, "How are you?" got the same answer every time. Fine. Always fine. She sat in the growing grey light until the sky shifted from deep blue to lavender to gold. At 6:30, Siki's alarm went off, followed by her sleepy voice calling out from the next room. "Mummy!" Elena drew a long breath, pushed herself upright, walked to her daughter's door. "I'm here," she said, her voice steady. Rise and shine, sweetheart. Or after dropping Chi-Chi at school, Elena didn't go straight home. She drove aimlessly for a while, circling the city until she found herself parked across from a familiar building, the high-rise where her old firm had been headquartered. She sat in her car, hands on the wheel, staring at the 30-story structure. Her office had been on the 12th floor. Was it still there? She'd left management to her partner Mark Zhao, and she'd heard the firm was doing well. Her phone rang. Elena, Mark's voice came through, warm with amusement. What are you doing parked outside? I just saw you from my window. Elena blinked, looked up toward the 12th floor, and saw a faint silhouette waving. Come on up, Mark said. I haven't seen you in years. Miss your face. She hesitated. She was a mess. No makeup, hair thrown up in a careless bun, sweatshirt and joggers that screamed suburban exhaustion. She didn't want anyone seeing her like this. You're stalling, Mark said. I already told the front desk to make you coffee. Extra milk, no sugar. Still your order, right? He remembered. Elena closed her eyes and got out of the car. The building lobby was unchanged. The elevator took her to 12, and the doors slid open onto the familiar logo wall, her design still there, if slightly recolored. The young receptionist didn't recognize her. Can I help you? Mark Zhao, Elena said. He's expecting me. Before the receptionist could ask for a name, Mark was striding down the hall. He'd put on some weight, his hair thinner than before, but his eyes were the same. Bright, quick, warm. He took her in from head to toe, smile holding steady, even as something flickered behind his gaze. Elena. He opened his arms. Long time. He hugged her briefly, then stepped back to steer her inside. Come on, let me show you around. We expanded last year, took over the whole next floor. She followed him through the open-plan office, past project boards and meeting rooms, and a kitchenette where someone was making tea. Everything was different, yet echoes of the old were everywhere. Her eyes landed on a cubicle in the corner. Remember that? Mark followed her gaze. That's where you used to sit. I tell all the new kids it's the founder's spot. Kid there now, fresh out of college, green as grass, but he's got the fire. Elena smiled, just a small one, and said nothing. In Mark's office, she sank into the leather sofa. He poured her coffee himself, slid the cup toward her. She looked at it. Extra milk, no sugar, perfect temperature. You still remember, she said. Of course I remember. You were my boss. Now you're mine. Mark waved a dismissive hand. The firm's still your baby. You've got the largest equity share. But honestly, Elena, what happened to you? I sent you dozens of invites. You never came. Elena wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into her palms. She couldn't explain it, how she'd slowly, methodically cut herself off from everything, first because of the pregnancies, then because of her health, then because Daniel had nudged her toward stillness, and then because she'd simply lost the will to reach out. She cleared her throat. I got divorced. Mark's face changed. He leaned forward. When? Yesterday. Her voice was quiet. Signed the papers. A beat of silence, then Mark swore under his breath. That bastard. You knew? Everyone in the industry knew, he snorted. His little affair with that actress, it was an open secret. I wanted to warn you, but you were... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. She'd been wrapped so tight inside her own bubble of domesticity that nothing from the outside could get through. Forget it. She stared down at her coffee. It's done. What's next? Mark asked. House? Money? The kid? House is mine. It's in the agreement. Money's all prenup. His assets stay his, mine stay mine. I still have my equity in his company, but that'll take time to liquidate. Siki's with me." She paused. "That's all I've got." Mark studied her for a long moment. Elena knew what he saw: a worn-down, middle-aged woman, rumpled and frayed, sitting in his glass-walled office like an extra who'd wandered onto the wrong set. "Elena," he finally said, his voice turning serious, "do you want to come back?" She looked up sharply. "I need someone," Mark said. "Market's tough right now, but I've got a project, medical tech, healthcare sector. Need a partner who actually knows what she's talking about. You built your whole career on this stuff. If you want back in, the door's open." She started, then stopped. "I'm not the person I used to be." "Bullshit," he cut her off. "You're Elena Lynn. Remember when we started this firm, you'd show up in a t-shirt and jeans and pitch $3 million deals without blinking. So what if you've been out for a while? That woman is still in there." He paused, looking her over carefully. "Just think about it. The spot's yours. Come back any time. Or don't. But for God's sake, don't stay buried in your house." Elena gripped her cup until her knuckles went white. Her throat was tight. Mark turned to the window, his back to her. "You know why I signed on with you in the first place, Elena? Because I paid well." "That too," he pivoted back. "But mostly because you had something special. A 24-year-old girl, fresh off a plane from Wall Street, no contacts, no resources, and she just built it all from nothing. You remember those meetings? Your eyes lit up when you talked strategy." His voice softened. "They've been dark for a long time now." Elena stared into the muddy brown of her coffee and saw her own reflection, indistinct and wavering. "I'll think about it," she said. "Good enough for me." She walked out of the building into pale autumn sunshine, the sky still grey, but the air carrying the faint sweetness of osmanthus. She'd walked this street 1,000 times before, back then in heels, moving fast, head full of numbers and next moves. Now she was in trainers, strolling past the familiar storefronts, noticing details she'd never registered. The florist was still there, the owner older but still the same. She stopped and looked at the buckets of fresh flowers, roses, lilies, daisies, sunflowers, all jostling together in exuberant profusion. Her eyes settled on a bundle of lizanthus, pale purple with white dusted edges, clean and quiet. "Can I have this one?" she asked. She drove to pick up Siti with the flowers in the passenger seat, their purple heads bobbing gently in the afternoon light. "Mummy, you bought flowers." Siti scrambled into her booster seat and leaned over to sniff. "They smell good." "Pretty, right?" "Really pretty." Siti nodded, then studied her mother's face with that unsettling clarity small children have. "Mummy, you look different today." Elena glanced in the rearview mirror. "Different how?" Siti considered it. "Your eyes are brighter." Elena froze for a moment, then smiled. It was a small smile, barely more than a ripple on still water, but it was real. That night, after Siti was asleep, Elena didn't sink into the couch as usual. She walked to the bathroom, wiped the steam off the mirror, and looked at herself. She was still heavy. Her skin was still dull, those fine lines still fanned from her eyes. But something was different. Maybe it was having spoken to Mark. Maybe it was the lisianthus still glowing on the dining table. Maybe it was simply having gone outside, talked to someone, remembered that she was still connected to the world. She looked at the woman in the mirror and asked the question out loud. "Do you want to go back?" Was that person, the one in the white suit, the one whose eyes burned, still alive inside this body? Elena took a long breath. She stepped onto the scale, looked down at the number. Tomorrow. She would start tomorrow. Chapter 2. The 5 a.m. alarm went off, and Elena was immediately convinced she'd lost her mind. She lay in bed, listening to the city's low morning hum, still dark outside, the grey-blue of deep autumn filtering through the blinds. She reached for her phone, squinting against the glare. 5 o'clock, exactly as she'd set it. 5 more minutes, the voice in her head whispered. What are you even doing? You're 38. Nobody's watching. But she sat up anyway. The cold air hit her as the covers fell away, and she shivered. Standing on the bedroom floor in her faded nightgown, she looked down at the sagging curve of her belly, took a deep breath, and started changing. The workout clothes still had the tag on, a relic of an old ambition, a gym membership she'd used exactly once. They were tight, the waistband digging into her soft middle, forcing her to suck in and struggle with the zipper. She crept out of the apartment so as not to wake Cece. Outside, the air was damp and fresh with the scent of wet grass. The street lights were still on, casting orange circles over the pavement, and tiny insects swirled in the glow. She started jogging along the path. She made it less than 200 yards before her lungs seized up. It felt like something was lodged in her chest, each breath scraped out with an iron taste, each leg too heavy to lift. She pushed forward anyway, heart hammering, teeth gritted. A man on a bench with a corgi watched her stagger past, his dog barking in amused alarm. She stopped after one lap, not because she wanted to, but because she physically couldn't continue. Bent over, hands on her knees, gasping, sweat dripping from her forehead to splatter dark spots on the pavement. She checked her phone. Less than half a mile, 7.5 minutes. Her 28-year-old self could run 3 miles without breathing hard. She straightened, wiped her face with her sleeve, and walked back toward the building. At the entrance, a neighbor emerged in a silk robe to retrieve her milk and stopped cold when she saw Elena. Elena? You're out. Exercising? Yeah. Elena wiped her brow and smiled. Trying to get moving again. The neighbor's eyes tracked up and down her body. At your age, you have to be careful. Don't hurt your knees. By the way, where's Daniel these days? He doesn't live here anymore. Elena said it flatly. We got divorced. The neighbor's face underwent a rapid transformation, shock, curiosity, barely concealed excitement, before settling into an unconvincing smile. Oh, well, I should get upstairs. Milk's getting warm. She practically fled into the elevator, and as the doors closed, Elena watched her pulling out her phone. Good. She'd rather it come from her than through the gossip mill. Home again, she found Cece still asleep, face buried in her pillow. Elena showered, the hot water waking every protesting muscle in her body, especially her thighs and core, which burned with an unfamiliar ache. She stood under the spray for a long time, watching the water run off her, the soft roll of her stomach visible through the glass. When she stepped out and dried off, she checked the scale. 67.3. Down 0.2 from yesterday, which she knew was just water weight. But at least she'd moved. The following week, she set strict rules. Wake at 5 every morning, run or walk for 30 minutes. No carbs at dinner, just vegetables and chicken. After Titi was asleep, 40 minutes of workout videos from her phone. The first 3 days nearly broke her. The running was brutal. The hunger made her lightheaded. The squats made her knees pop. On day 4, when the alarm blared, she rolled over and considered quitting. But a voice inside said, "Yesterday, you told Mark you'd think about it. Are you done thinking?" She got up. By week 2, her body seemed to have surrendered. The run stretched from half a mile to 3/4, still hard, but no longer impossible. The workout moves came more fluidly. Her knees stopped popping. The scale ticked downward, slowly but steadily. 66.8, 66.3, 65.9. By late October, she ran into Patricia Shen at Siki's school pickup. Patricia, draped in a Chanel suit with a limited edition handbag, lit up when she spotted Elena. "Elena, it's been ages. You've gotten—" She drew closer, eyes narrowing with appraisal. "You've lost weight." Elena looked down at herself. She had lost a little. Her waist was still far from its old state, but the soft roundness of her face had begun to sharpen. "Trying to get in shape," Elena said. Patricia leaned in, dropping her voice. "And I heard about you and Daniel." Her eyes glittered with that particular blend of sympathy and salaciousness. "It's true?" "It's true." "Oh, that's such a shame." Patricia's expression was a masterclass in false commiseration. "You two were such a lovely couple. Well, you know what they say, a woman can thrive on her own. You must be exhausted, raising a child alone. Please, tell me if you need anything." Elena smiled and said nothing. She knew exactly what Patricia wanted: details, scandal, something to fuel the next round of gossip. "I'm hosting a small get-together next week," Patricia went on. "A few of the girls, facials, then dinner at the new French place. You should come, get out of the house for a bit." "Next week might not work," Elena said. "I'm going back to work." Patricia blinked. Something shifted in her expression. "Back to work where?" "My old firm." "Elena, at your age, why would you work?" Patricia's tone curdled slightly. "You've dropped some weight, sure, but you still need to focus on upkeep or—" Her eyes swept over Elena's face, measuring. "Work is so draining. You don't need the money." "I need something to do," Elena said simply. Patricia smiled again, a tight little thing that said clearly she believed Elena would regret this. "Well, if you change your mind, you know how to reach me." She clicked away on her heels. Elena watched her go, remembering that she had been part of that circle once, clad in the same labels, carrying the same bags, chatting the same conversations. She'd been so proud of her easy life. But now she understood that that world had a quiet way of dissolving you. It told you that safety was freedom, that comfort was a prize. And then, when you finally needed to climb out, you realized your limbs had gone soft. Siti burst out of the school gates and collided with her legs. "Mummy, we made paper flowers today. Look!" She pulled a crumpled pink origami blossom from her backpack. Elena crouched to admire it with appropriate gravity. "It's beautiful. I'm putting it on the fridge." Siti beamed and skipped ahead. Elena tucked the little flower carefully into her coat pocket and watched her daughter's tiny back, something warm and full expanding in her chest. In early November, she called Mark. "I'm ready," she said. "I'm coming back." He laughed. "Knew you couldn't stay away. Next Monday work for you?" "Monday is perfect." The first Monday morning, Elena woke at 6, an hour earlier than usual. She stood in front of her closet for a long time, staring at clothes that no longer fit. The old suits were out of the question. They'd laugh at her if she tried to squeeze into them. Casual clothes seemed too informal. Finally, she settled on a black knit top, navy wide-leg trousers, and a blazer that was loose enough to button just barely. She put on light makeup, concealed the circles under her eyes, and swept her hair into a low ponytail. In the mirror, she still looked wrong. Too soft in the face, too thick in the waist. Competent was still a distant dream, but she looked better than last week. She woke Sichi, dressed her, and drove her to school. In the back seat, Sichi asked, "Mummy, why are you all dressed up? Where are you going?" "Mummy's going to work." "Work?" Cici tilted her head. "What kind of work?" "The same kind I used to do, helping people with their money." Cici considered this with the gravity of a small philosopher. "Okay, good luck, Mummy." At the school gate, Elena crouched to kiss her daughter's forehead. "Grandma's picking you up this afternoon. I'll come to Grandma's house after I'm done." Cici nodded and scampered off. Elena stood, took a long breath, and walked to the car. Her palms were sweating by the time she pulled into the office parking lot. She sat in the driver's seat for 2 minutes, checking her makeup in the rearview mirror. Not bad. She'd covered the dark circles, and the dusty rose lipstick gave her some color. She stepped out, heels clicking on pavement, and walked toward the building. In the lobby, an elevator was about to close. She hurried and pressed the button. The doors slid back to reveal 2 young men in sharp suits, deep in conversation. Their eyes glanced over her. A quick assessment, then away. No malice, just acknowledgement of a stranger. The elevator rose. The men chatted about industry news, healthcare policy shifts, overvalued A rounds. Elena listened from her corner and realized that even though she'd been out for 3 years, the terms and the logic and the frameworks were still in her head. Like riding a bike, you never really forgot. On 12, the doors opened. The receptionist recognized her this time, or Mark had briefed her, and smiled. "Good morning, Ms. Lin. Mr. Zhao is expecting you." Ms. Lin. That old name. For years, she'd been Elena to Patricia's circle, Mrs. Zhou to everyone else. Ms. Lin was someone from a different era. She walked through the open office, past ringing phones and clattering keyboards, to Mark's door. "Get in here." He waved her in from behind his desk, stacks of documents spread around him. "That's a better look on you. Sit." She sat. "What do you have for me?" He slid a file across the desk. "Medical tech play. Neurostimulation plus AI rehab, focusing on stroke recovery. Founding team solid. CTO's got a PhD from MIT. CEO came out of a major medical device group. They're raising an A round, and I think we should take a look." Elena opened the file and read. "Market analysis, technology assessment, financial projections." The numbers washed over her with surprising familiarity, like old friends she'd thought she'd lost touch with. She read carefully, mentally running her own due diligence. "Valuation's high," she said when she finished. "Their tech advantage over the competition isn't as clear as they claim. The AI training set has only 120 patients. That's too small to be convincing. At this valuation, if the clinical data underperforms in the next round, we'll be the bag holder." Mark leaned back in his chair, studying her with unmistakable satisfaction. "This is exactly why I needed you. Their deck wowed everyone else. You spotted the problem in 15 minutes. "You spotted it too," Elena said. "You just wanted confirmation." "Maybe," he grinned. "You're recovering faster than I expected." She didn't respond to that. Her hands looked neat in her lap, freshly manicured, a whisper of nude polish on her nails. 2 weeks ago, she'd been drowning in divorce paperwork and self-pity, and now she was discussing valuations and risk profiles. She felt more solid than she had in years. "What's next?" she asked. "We meet the founder. You lead the Q&A. I'll play backup." "Fine." They drove out to a tech park in the south end of the city that afternoon, to a small converted loft where a dozen employees worked in bright, open chaos. The founder, Mr. Chen, was in his early 40s, lean, fast-talking, with that particular intensity that technology entrepreneurs seem to carry in their bones. Elena spent 2 hours with him. She dug into everything: the technical specs, the clinical trial design, the go-to-market strategy. Some questions made him pause, run a hand through his hair, and think before answering. Mark sat in the corner drinking coffee and barely said 3 words. When it was over, Chen shook her hand warmly. "Ms. Lin, you really understand this space. Mark told me you used to be in investment, but I didn't realize you were this deep in it." She smiled. "I spent some years on Wall Street covering healthcare M&A, and I've kept up with the sector since. I may have been out for a while, but I haven't forgotten the fundamentals." "That's exactly what we need," he said. "It's not just the capital, it's the network, the expertise, the insight. We want partners who get it." On the drive back, Mark was at the wheel, Elena in the passenger seat. The sky was darkening, the city lights bleeding into a river of gold and red. "You know what I realized?" Mark said suddenly. "Watching you with him, I felt like I was back 10 years ago. Same speed, same logic, same I know I'm right energy." He glanced sideways at her. "You really haven't changed." Elena stared out the window, her reflection ghosting over the glass. She didn't feel unchanged. Her body was still heavy, her face was still round. But Mark wasn't talking about those things. He was talking about the fire. "I'm not all the way back yet," she said quietly. "Give me time." "There's no rush," he said. "You've got all the time in the world." She picked up Titi at Mrs. Wang's that evening. Daniel's mother was a soft-spoken southern woman with nimble hands that made beautiful food and eyes that had watched too much. She'd known about the divorce before anyone, and she'd handled it with a quiet dignity that surprised no one. She'd held Elena's hand and said, "You've done enough, child." At the door, Mrs. Wang ushered her in with a warm smile. "Titi's just finishing her drawing." Elena found her daughter on the living room floor, flat on her stomach, face stained with blue marker, tongue poking out in concentration. "Mummy, look!" Titi held up her masterpiece. It showed 3 figures, tall, medium, and very small. "What's the small one?" Elena asked. "That's Dapple," Titi announced. "The cat that lives under Grandma's building. I fed him a hot dog." Mrs. Wang laughed from the doorway. She insisted. I couldn't say no. Elena stroked her daughter's hair. "It's beautiful. We'll hang it up at home." "Can we take Dapple home?" Titi looked up with those round, pleading eyes. "He's so lonely, all by himself." Elena crouched down to her daughter's level. "Animals are a big responsibility, you know. You have to feed them, walk them, take them to the vet, play with them. Can you do all of that?" "Yes!" Titi nodded with violent enthusiasm. "Then we'll ask the building management tomorrow and see if we can adopt him." Titi bounced up in joy. Mrs. Wang, watching from the kitchen, reached out and patted Elena's hand. "You look better," she said quietly. "Thinner, more alive. That's good." Something rose in Elena's throat. She stepped forward and hugged her mother-in-law, her voice cracking. "Thank you, Mama." Mrs. Wang just rubbed her back in steady circles. That night, Cici fell asleep on the couch, still clutching her drawing. Elena carried her to bed, tucked her in, and returned to the living room. The city glowed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, thousands of lights, thousands of stories. Her own story was a new chapter. She pulled out her phone and found the old photo of 28-year-old Elena. She looked at it for a long time. Then she walked to the bathroom and turned the mirror back to face the room. The woman in the glass was still too heavy, still not beautiful enough, still carrying the traces of her bruises. But in her eyes, just barely, there was a tiny light. It was enough. Chapter 3. On the 1st of December, Elena stepped on the scale and saw 63.8. She stared at the number for a long moment, making sure her eyes weren't fooling her. 63.8, nearly 7 pounds lighter than she'd been 2 months ago. Still nowhere near her old 102, but at least she no longer felt like her clothes were holding their breath when she dressed. She turned sideways in front of the mirror and saw, just barely, a line defining her waist. Her hip curve was still there, her chest was still there, but the section between them was beginning to resolve into something more distinct. She patted her stomach and thought, keep going. By then, her entire routine had flipped. She was up at 5:30 every morning, running nearly 2 miles without stopping. Her evening workout had stretched from 40 minutes to an hour, with added strength training, dumbbells, planks, crunches. She'd restructured her diet around lean protein and vegetables, cut out most refined carbs and all alcohol. She'd even stopped missing the wine she used to drink with Daniel. She discovered she didn't need it to feel anything. The changes were incremental but undeniable. Her skin had more elasticity, her face had more definition, her collarbones were visible. One afternoon at Sichi's school pickup, the teacher did a double take and asked if she'd lost weight. "I'm trying," Elena said, smiling. Work was progressing too. She'd finalized the term sheet with Chen's company and was leading the due diligence team through the legal and financial review. Mark had started handing her new projects. She was traveling again, meeting founders, attending pitches. Some days she was in meetings from breakfast to dusk, grabbing a salad at her desk and going straight back in. One night, after a late session that ran until past 7, she sat alone in her car in the parking garage and felt wetness on her cheeks. She touched her face and found tears. She didn't know why she was crying, whether it was exhaustion or relief or something else finally working its way out of her system. She sat there and let it happen for 5 minutes, then wiped her face and drove to Mrs. Wang's. That night, Tichi asked, "Mummy, why are your eyes all red?" "I was happy today, baby," she said. "Really happy." Sichi nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "Then I want you to be happy every day." "So do I," Elena said. "So do I." Patricia invited her to a holiday lunch in mid-December. Elena hesitated. 2 months ago she'd have refused outright, but something in her decided she could handle it now. The restaurant was a new French place with a private room. Elena wore a simple black dress she'd bought the week before, cinched at the waist to disguise what was still there. When she walked in, the roomful of women turned in unison to appraise her. "Elena," Patricia rose first. "You look amazing. How much weight have you lost?" "Just taking better care of myself," Elena said. "It's more than that," another woman, Mrs. Liu, who'd always been relatively kind, observed. "Your whole energy is different. What are you doing with yourself now?" "I went back to work, my old firm." A tiny pause. Patricia's smile froze for a fraction of a second before restarting. "Work? How fulfilling. Come, sit. The tasting menu is wonderful." Over lunch, the conversation followed its predictable script. Beauty, shopping, children, husbands, complaints about in-laws, triumphant announcements about new Birkins. Elena listened, contributed a few words here and there, and mostly ate in peace. Over dessert, Patricia brought up Daniel. "Did you hear about him?" She leaned in, practically vibrating with insider knowledge. "His actress girlfriend dumped him for a younger man, and his company's stock has taken a hit. A product quality issue got flagged by regulators." Elena kept her face very still. Inside, she felt something shift. Not affection, not satisfaction, just an acknowledgement that the world kept turning. "That's too bad," she said. "I hope it works out for him." Patricia's eyes searched her expression for cracks, found none, and moved on. After the meal, Elena walked to the parking lot alone, the December night cold against her face. She got in the car and checked her phone, a message from Mark. "Free this weekend? I want to introduce you to someone." "Who?" "Who?" "A buddy from my old network, medical devices. Spent years at a big pharma, now doing his own venture. Solid project, but I need an expert eye." She texted back, "Saturday afternoon?" "Perfect." Saturday afternoon, Mark picked her up. They drove to a coffee shop in the Midtown district. Elena arrived early, ordered an Americano, and settled by the window. The winter sunlight slanted in, warming the tabletop. A few minutes later, a man walked in. Tall, maybe early 40s, in a dark grey sweater and black trousers. Not conventionally handsome, but there was something settled and comfortable about his presence, a deep stillness in his eyes that made him easy to look at. He scanned the room, found Elena, and walked over. "Elena?" His voice was low, warm, with a slight smile. "I'm Ethan. Mark's told me about you." "Ethan." She stood and shook his hand. Dry, warm, his grip firm but not aggressive. "Please, sit." He slid into the opposite seat and set his coat aside. "Mark says you're the person to talk to about medical investment. I'm hoping you can give me your honest take." He ordered a latte, then opened his bag and handed her a document. "Here's the business plan. Tear it apart, please. I can't stand people who sugarcoat things." Elena opened the file. The project was a minimally invasive surgical robot, novel approach, strong team, impressive technical specs. She read carefully, pausing at key sections, evaluating assumptions. "Your technical path," she said, looking up. "You're not going head-to-head with the Da Vinci system, are you? You're going lightweight." Ethan's eyebrows lifted. "You saw that immediately. Yes, the big systems are too expensive. Most hospitals can't afford them. We're modular, focused on a single surgical approach, building deep expertise. We can get the cost down to about a third of the imported alternatives." "Clinical data?" 70+ cases so far, with good outcomes. We're expanding to a multi-center trial at 3 major hospitals. If that data holds, regulatory clearance should be straightforward. She asked more questions about patents, about market rollout, about manufacturing costs. He answered each one with clarity, never deflecting or over-promising. His voice was unhurried, relaxed, like he was chatting with an old friend over drinks. After nearly an hour, Mark arrived, looking between them with a knowing grin. "Well, I'm clearly not needed. You two seem to have found your rhythm." Ethan laughed. "Your friend's sharp, Mark. Elena, I'd love to keep talking." "I'd like that," she said. "Actually, we're doing an internal demo next week," Ethan added. "At the lab. You should come see the hardware in action." "Sure." Mark made an exaggerated face, and Elena shot him a look. That evening, she waited outside the coffee shop for a ride, the cold wind biting through her coat. She heard footsteps behind her, then Ethan's voice. "Need a ride? I'm heading in your general direction." She hesitated, then accepted. His car was a grey sedan, clean and simple, with a faint scent of cedar. She gave him her address and settled into the passenger seat. "You were asking the right questions," he said as he pulled into traffic. "Most people don't notice the cost structure issues." "I followed a deal once that died because of exactly that," she said. a company that chased features instead of viability. They ended up selling to a competitor at a loss. That's what I'm trying to avoid. He steered smoothly through the intersection. You either keep your costs under control, or you don't survive. She glanced sideways at him, the streetlights crossing his face in alternating planes of light and shadow. Something about his steadiness felt comfortable. How long have you been in this industry? She asked. 15 years. 8 at the big company, then started my own projects. Some worked, some failed. This one, he tapped the wheel. This one matters. Aren't you afraid of failure? Of course, he smiled. But being afraid isn't a reason to stay still. She didn't answer, but the words lodged somewhere inside her. He pulled up to her building. She unbuckled and thanked him. Don't forget next week's demo, he said. I won't. She stood in the cold and watched his taillights fade into the night. The next week, she visited his lab with Mark. The space was in a medical tech campus, compact but well-equipped. Ethan demonstrated the robot, a compact machine with responsive feedback, intuitive controls, and impressive precision. Elena tested it on a simulation system. The haptic feedback translated her movements smoothly. It feels right, she said. Took us 8 months to calibrate that, Ethan said. Too light and you lose realism. Too heavy and the surgeon gets fatigued. Mark was impressed by the industrial design. Gorgeous casing. Who did this? A German-Chinese design house. Medical devices need to inspire confidence at first glance. Over lunch at the campus canteen, they drifted into casual conversation. Elena noticed Ethan ate slowly, chewing thoroughly, arranging his utensils with quiet care. She didn't know why she noticed. How old's your daughter? He asked her. 5, she said. I've got a 7-year-old. She's a handful. She wanted a hamster last month. I caved. Elena laughed. My daughter's campaigning for a cat. I think I'm about to cave too. Bad idea, Ethan said, shaking his head. Cats are harder than hamsters. Prepare yourself. When they stood outside later, the December sky lowering and cold, Mark excused himself for a meeting. Elena lingered for a moment, and so did Ethan. You seem different than when we first met, he said. More settled, more present. She wasn't sure what to say to that. Anyway, he went on easily, I'll be in touch. Chapter 4. Christmas dinner was supposed to be a regular meal. Ethan had chosen a private restaurant tucked inside a colonial-era building, all exposed brick and honeyed light. Elena arrived to find Mark and Ethan already deep in conversation. Ethan was in a navy shirt, sleeves rolled up, and he rose to pull out the chair beside him. The food was excellent. The conversation was easy. Industry talk, market chatter, funny anecdotes. Mark told a story that made Elena laugh until her sides ached. Then Mark's phone rang. He covered it, murmured something, and stood with an apologetic look. My wife says our sink exploded. I've got to go, but the bill's covered. You're not paying, Ethan said. I invited. Go. At the door, Mark shot Elena a look that said everything and nothing. She pretended not to see it. The room settled into quiet again. Ethan poured her more tea. He does that on purpose, you know, she said mildly. Does what? The emergency exit, she smiled. Christmas dinner, it's a tradition with him. Ethan laughed. Maybe, but I'm not complaining. She asked about his daughter. He said she was with his ex-wife for the holiday. They had a ritual, and he respected it. You don't seem surprised, he observed. That I'm also divorced? I am too. Ethan's glass paused mid-air, then he smiled again. Then we're both turning a page. Exactly. She lifted her tea. One page down. They clinked cups. Outside, distant fireworks popped against the winter sky. That evening, he drove her home and didn't move to unlock the doors right away. Elena, he said, I really enjoyed tonight. Me too. Could I see you again? Outside work? She met his eyes, clear, straightforward, unguarded. Yes, she said, but slowly. Slowly, he agreed. I can do that. New Year came and went. Ethan's project passed internal review. Elena was managing the post-investment oversight, meeting with him regularly, sometimes in his lab, sometimes for meals that blurred the line between professional and personal. He was true to his word about slowly. He never bombarded her with texts, never pressured her for more. Their message threads were mostly work-related: patent progress, clinical updates, financing strategy. But there were small kindnesses woven in. Dress warm today. How's the cat? Siki's cough. Is she okay? He remembered everything she told him: her daughter's schedule, her food preferences, her offhand comments. It wasn't aggressive, it was consistent, like steady ground beneath her feet. By late January, she stepped on the scale. 61.2. 12 pounds lost in 3 months. In the mirror, she saw a waist returning, a sharper face, collarbones rediscovered, arms reshaping. She tried on the old white suit from 10 years ago. It was still snug, but it fastened. She stood in front of the mirror and laughed. In early February, she decided to purge everything. She spent the weekend dismantling the home she'd shared with Daniel. Every gift, every shared piece of furniture, every framed photograph. She pulled down the wedding portrait from the wall. The label on the back read, May 20th, 2016. She turned it over and looked at her younger self in a red chipao, smiling next to Daniel in a matching smile. She boxed it. Then the jewelry, the watches, the bags, some for resale, some for donation. She worked methodically, without sentimentality. At the bottom of the last box, she found a tiny case. Inside, a tarnished silver ring, engraved E and D on the inner band. She remembered it. Daniel had bought it at a street stall before he'd made any money, when he'd knelt in front of her and promised, "Someday I'll get you a real one." And he had. But somewhere along the way, the man who'd knelt had disappeared. She held the ring for a long moment. Then she put it back, closed the case, and tucked it into the bottom of the box. She would keep it, not as nostalgia, but as a reminder. People change completely, become unrecognizable. She never wanted to be someone's attachment again. That night, the apartment felt bigger, empty in a way that made room for new things. She sat on the floor, back against the sofa, and looked out at the glowing skyline. Her phone lit up. Ethan. Industry gathering next Wednesday at the Mandarin Club. Medical investment focus. Want to come? Sure. Can I pick you up? Yes. She paused, then typed. Cleared out all the old stuff today. Feels good. His reply came back. Clearing space is how you make room. She smiled and put the phone down. Wednesday evening, Ethan picked her up. He wore a dark navy suit with a white shirt, no tie. His eyes widened just slightly when he saw her. She was in a forest green velvet dress, fitted to the body she'd been rebuilding, her hair loose and swept into gentle waves. Beautiful, he said simply. She smiled. Thank you. At the club, the room was thick with industry names. Elena navigated easily, reconnecting with familiar faces. A venture capitalist named Mr. Yang recognized her instantly. "Elena Lynn, I hardly recognize you. You look fantastic." "Work in progress," she said. Mr. Yang introduced her to his circle. She talked about the surgical robotics project, fielding questions with precision and confidence. Within 10 minutes, a small crowd had gathered around her. At one point, someone mentioned Daniel. "Is he here tonight? I think I saw him." The conversation hung for a moment. Elena didn't flinch. "I'm not sure," she said evenly. "But there are plenty of interesting people here regardless." She moved on smoothly. At the end of the evening, Patricia found her on the terrace, away from the crowd. "Did you see him?" Patricia asked breathlessly. "Daniel's here, with his investors. He looks terrible. His company is in real trouble." Elena looked out at the garden lights, sipping her champagne. "I haven't noticed." "Don't you want to gloat, even a little?" "No," Elena said. "I don't want anything about him anymore. I just want to live my own life." Patricia stared at her. "You've changed." "For better or worse?" "I don't know, but something's loosened in you." Elena smiled. Later, Daniel found her on the terrace. She turned to find him standing a few feet away, diminished in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the polished man she remembered, but someone worn thinner. "Elena." His voice was quiet. "Daniel." "You look..." He stopped, swallowed. "You look incredible." "Thank you." They stood in silence. Then he said, "I'm sorry for everything." Elena looked at him. She felt a prickle in her chest, not from his words, but from the realization that she no longer needed them. "I know," she said. And then she walked away. Ethan found her later in the ballroom, talking to a group of investors about healthcare innovation. He stood at the edge, patient, until she finished. When she came to him, he handed her a glass of water. "Your champagne," he said. "I took it. Better drink this." She took it, their fingers brushing. The warmth lingered. "Is that your girlfriend?" a voice asked nearby, and she looked up to see a woman in blue, Ethan's cousin, as it turned out, visiting from Shanghai. "Just friends," Ethan said smoothly. But the look he gave Elena had heat in it. "Elena," he said, stepping closer. "You said slowly. It's been almost 4 months now. Can we speed up a little?" She held his gaze. No pressure, no demand, just straightforward honesty. She smiled. "Yes." That night, driving home through the city's velvet dark, she felt light, almost buoyant. She pulled into her parking spot, sat for a moment with the engine off, looking up at the warm-lit window of her apartment. Titty and Dapple the cat were up there, waiting. She walked inside. Mrs. Wang was on the couch, knitting. The cat was curled in Cixie's bed. She hugged Mrs. Wang, drank the warm soup left on the stove, and went to her bedroom. Before she turned off the light, she caught herself in the mirror. A woman with sharp collarbones, an upright spine, eyes that held their own fire again. She touched her reflection's face and smiled. Her phone buzzed. "Ethan, good night." She typed back, "Night." And she lay down in the dark, her smile still glowing long after she'd closed her eyes.